Continuing on with Chapter 12, we're going to continue looking at this resulting nationalism that came out of the War of 1812. So, after the War of 1812, the Federalists are essentially gone. The election of 1816 actually marks the last time the Federalist Party ran a candidate, even though there was no chance that he was going to win. And James Monroe, a Virginian and a Democratic Republican, or also known as just a Republican, was elected in 1816. And for this period of time, there is a one-party rule, meaning the Federalists are dead. In fact, this is showing the division or the splitting the gap between the old and the new generations. In fact, Monroe was the first of the presidents not to be a founding father. His period in office is often referred to as the era of good feelings. Following his election in 1816, he went on a goodwill tour that the newspapers coined the era of good feelings, that everything seems great, everything seems wonderful. The Federalists are gone. There is a lack of sectionalism going on, at least for the time being. There is a focus on nationalism in the United States. However, the era of good feelings is very disconcerting because it's not all roses and sunshine at the time. There's a lot of problems going on under the surface. There's issues with the tariff. There are issues with the Bank of the U.S. There's issues over slavery, etc. So even though the era of good feeling seems like everything's great on the surface, and in fact, Monroe's presidency was fraught with issues such as these. So it's not as glamorous as it might seem. So, for example, some of these issues below the surface, dealing with slavery specifically. Out of the Louisiana Territory, a new state is applying for statehood, the state of Missouri, who applied for statehood in 1819. They were hoping to enter the Union as a slave state. The problem with this is Missouri entering the Union would have upset the balance of power between slave and free states. And so Northern men worried about this, promoted what's known as the Talmadge Amendment. This was a proposed law in the House of Representatives that said that there should not be any slaves allowed in Missouri, and for those slaves that are living there, there would be gradual emancipation for their children, for those who were living there right now. So this showed that Northerners were afraid about disrupting the balance of power between the North and the South. But more specifically, the South freaked out about this Talmadge Amendment. They did not want to create a precedent by which they would not be allowed to take their slaves wherever they wanted to. They would not be allowed to move to Missouri or any of the other territories in the Louisiana territory. The South also felt that the North was already wealthier, they were more populous, meaning they already had control over the House of Representatives. The Senate should at least be somewhat more evenly divided in their eyes. So this issue is not about slavery for a moral reason, but it's more about political power. Who has power? Is it going to be the South, or is it going to be in the North? Or is there going to continue to be a division of power within the Senate? So here's the compromise that they came up with, the Missouri Compromise. Very, very, very important. The Missouri Compromise said that not only would Missouri be allowed to enter as a slave state, but the state of Maine would also be created, carved out of what had been Massachusetts. Maine would be a free state. So it's adding two states to the Union at once, one slave, one free, to maintain that balance of power. It also said in the Missouri Compromise that slavery would not be allowed in the Louisiana Territory north of the 3630 parallel, and that's going to be very important later on. So for the time being, the issue of slavery did not divide the country. So this maintained the peace for the next 15 years. Or according to Jefferson, who was watching this obviously from retirement, and Jefferson is kind of a tricky guy because he owned slaves, yet he was against slavery. According to Jefferson, we have the wolf by the ears, and we can neither hold him safely nor let him go. To him, this is exactly what slavery was. It was a dicey issue that eventually you're going to have to let that wolf go, and he's going to devour you, which is exactly what happened during the Civil War. So by 1824, Monroe was almost unanimously reelected. In fact, only one electoral vote was retained in order to allow George Washington to be the only president to have been unanimously elected. But this shows you there is no division of power in the United States. It's all Republicans. The Federalists are gone. That is, except on the Supreme Court. even though the Federalist Party is dead, they still are from beyond the grave controlling the Supreme Court, because remember, all federal judges are appointed for life. John Marshall is one that never dies, apparently. John Marshall is still the Chief Justice on the Supreme Court, and to him, he is still reinforcing these Federalist ideals, specifically the power of the federal court, or the federal government, I should say. So several court cases you need to know under John Marshall. And remember, he's important from that power of judicial review that he essentially created in Marbury versus Madison. In 1819, in the court case of McCulloch versus Maryland, here's the background story. The state of Maryland was trying to destroy a branch of the Bank of the United States by taxing, quote, any banknotes not chartered in the state of Maryland. Well, the Bank of the United States was the only bank not chartered in the state of Maryland. So this was kind of a see-through thing that Maryland was trying to do to try to get rid of the Bank of the United States. And we'll talk more about why the Democratic Republicans hated the Bank of the United States when we talk about Andrew Jackson. In McCulloch versus Maryland, John Marshall reaffirmed the elastic clause, that there are certain powers that are implied in the Constitution, that the bank is constitutional because it is, quote, necessary and proper for the American people. So reaffirming that elastic clause, that the Constitution was, quote, intended to endure for the ages. So in McCulloch versus Maryland, he's really making this differentiation between implied powers, or that elastic clause, versus enumerated powers, or those powers that the federal government have because it's specifically written down in the U.S. Constitution. He's also identifying this idea of federalism, that there is a division between states' governments and the federal government, and the federal government reigns supreme over some issues. Specifically in the court case of Cohens versus Virginia in 1821. The background story of this, and this is less important, but in the state of Virginia, the Cohens family was found guilty by the Virginia Supreme Court for illegally selling lottery tickets from the District of Columbia. Now, who actually cares whether or not the Cohens family were selling lottery tickets in Virginia from D.C.? The reality was that the U.S. Supreme Court upheld the state Supreme Court from Virginia. They upheld their decision that, yes, the Cohens family was found guilty of this. But the reason this is important because it establishes the precedent that the U.S. Supreme Court has the right to review state Supreme Court's decision when it involves federal power. So the fact that the Cohens family was transporting lottery tickets over state lines made it a federal issue. So the Supreme Court is the supreme law of the land. Also in 1824, Gibbons versus Ogden, the state of New York tried to grant a monopoly on steamboat navigation between the states of New York and New Jersey to one company. Now, once again, who cares what the state of New York was trying to do? The reason this is important is because John Marshall asserted that navigation, steamboat navigation specifically, from one state to another is part of commerce, or the Commerce Clause, which is in the U.S. Constitution. The U.S. Constitution specifically says interstate commerce, or commerce between the states, or trade between the states, is reserved to the federal government. So here in Gibbons versus Ogden, John Marshall is asserting that steamboat navigation is something that should be reserved to the federal government, or the Commerce Clause between the states. Okay, two more court cases to know, and these are for a lesser reason. 1810, Fletcher versus Peck. The state of Georgia had illegally, based on the fact that they'd been given a bribe by a company of speculators, sold 35 million acres in the state of Georgia to this land company. However, when the people of Georgia found out about this, they got very angry. There was public outrage, and the state legislature tried to undo this law. However, the Supreme Court ruled in Fletcher versus Peck they didn't have the right to, because the company that had bought this land was asserting its property rights. And therefore, the state government does not have the right to undo this contract, even if it was made based on a bribe. This is property rights. And also going along with this, Dartmouth College versus Woodward, the Dartmouth College had been granted a charter under the former king, George III, and the state of New Hampshire was trying to change that original charter. However, in Dartmouth College versus Woodward, once again, John Marshall ruled that the original charter should remain intact because it was a contract. So even though it was a contract that was created under King George III, it was still a legal contract and therefore can't be undone. So promoting the federal government's power, John Marshall. So let's take a look at Florida. So we remember Andrew Jackson from the Battle of New Orleans. Andrew Jackson is going to continue on down in the southern region, specifically attacking the Native Americans down in that area in the First Seminole War. Hostile Native Americans from the Seminole tribe, along with fugitive slaves, would attack American settlements and then run away and hide in Spanish Florida. Andrew Jackson used this as an excuse to march into Florida, where he hung these Native Americans, British sympathizers, and captured 2 Spanish forts at St. Mark's and Pensacola. Now, the reason this is important is because Andrew Jackson has just marched into a foreign country, and the United States is extremely worried that this is going to result in a war with Spain. So Secretary of State at this time, John Quincy Adams, found a way to use these lemons and turn it into lemonade, so to speak. John Quincy Adams, working with the Spanish Foreign Minister, Onus, created the Florida Purchase Agreement, also known as the Adams-Onus Treaty in 1819. So the United States doesn't need to worry about a war with Florida because we bought Florida for $5 million from Spain in order to avoid war and also to add to the territory that the United States controls. So this now establishes a western boundary for the United States in a zigzaggy pattern, and you'll see in a second, at the 42nd parallel. So adding to the territory that the United States controls. So here you see the Adams-Onus Treaty, adding all of this territory in what was Spanish Florida. You see the Louisiana Purchase or the Missouri Territory still left, and this zigzaggy pattern all the way to the 42nd parallel. Obviously, Oregon country is coming later on. All right, and last but not least, let's take a look at the Monroe Doctrine, an extremely piece of American history once again. John Quincy Adams as Secretary of State, and remember the job of the Secretary of State is to deal with foreign governments. Now he was the Secretary of State under James Monroe. So in 1823, James Monroe, working in conjunction with his Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, created a doctrine which was delivered to Congress in his annual address. This is basically Monroe's foreign policy, the Monroe Doctrine in 1823. And here's what it said. The United States would no longer tolerate European interference in the Western Hemisphere. It is establishing spheres of influence. The United States will deal with any issue over here on the Western Hemisphere. Europe needs to worry about their side of the world. Specifically, the United States was worried about the Spanish trying to reclaim all of their territory that they had lost in Latin and South America. And we were worried about these countries, or the Spanish then, trying to infiltrate the United States as well. So even though the Monroe Doctrine, it really didn't have much of an effect at the time, what really was backing this up was the British Navy. The British Navy, or the British government, I should say, had a reasoning behind promoting the Monroe Doctrine because they were able to get a much better trade agreement with these now independent Latin American countries as opposed to dealing with the Spanish. So the British Navy, at least in the beginning, was what was backing up the Monroe Doctrine. To add to this, this is going to be a doctrine that would be used later on, used, not used, depending on the president at the time and whether or not it was in their best interest. This is by no means a law, more of a statement that future presidents would use, saying, asserting America's power in the world affairs. And that is it for Chapter 12.